everybody. We're going to, while Jason is arriving and setting things up, I'm just going to very quickly run through the health and safety features for the evening before we start. So if there is a fire alarm and we need to leave, there is nothing scheduled. The fire exit is through the main foyer that you came in and out onto 7 Woodland Road. And the toilets, if you need them, are by the stairs to the right-hand side of the foyer. So again, go out these doors. So that's all on the fun, exciting health and safety stuff. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. GWR Railways have again meant that Jason has arrived a little bit later than we were anticipating. So while he's just kind of setting things up, and thank you for just running in without any kind of notice, I'd just like to take a few minutes just to intro tonight's speaker and the lecture series. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this British Academy lecture, hosted in partnership with the Faculty for Arts, Law and Social Sciences here at the University of Bristol. I'm Professor Esther Dermott. I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the faculty. The British Academy, for those of you who don't know, is an independent fellowship of world-leading scholars, a funding body for research and a forum for debate. And as the UK's National Academy for the Humanities and Social Sciences, it mobilises these disciplines and also advocates for them. And similarly, and why we're really very happy that we can host the lecture this evening, our new faculty also brings together those shape disciplines and embraces the really critical role played by the arts, humanities, law and social sciences in order to address the challenges faced by complex societies, ensuring that we are able to better understand the past, interpret the present and envision the future. So, held in partnership with universities across the UK, the British Academy Lecture Series showcases the very best scholarship in these disciplines and stimulates discussion. And I'm therefore delighted to introduce this evening's lecturer, Professor Jason Arday, who I'm sure will do all of that. So let me just say briefly a little bit about Jason. So he is the Professorial Chair in the Sociology of Education at the University of Cambridge. And previously he was a Professor of Sociology of Education at the University of Glasgow. He's a trustee of the Runnymede Trust, which is the UK's leading race equality think tank, and also the British Sociological Association, the BSA. He sits on the Centre for Labour and Social Studies National Advisory Panel, the NHS Race and Health Observatory Academic Reference Group, and the ITV Cultural Advisory Council. He's been a guest editor on BBC Radio 4's Today programme, and in 2023 was listed 4th on the prestigious Shaw Trust Disability Power 100. It's great that so many people have turned out this evening to hear this lecture. I know that I and everybody else here are really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And I'm going to let you introduce the content, which you can do much better than I can, with your lecture, I Know What I Know, the Story of Graceland. So thank you very much, and over to you.
Good evening, everyone. How are you all keeping? You well? Honestly, like I was on the train, you wake up this morning, I'm like, right, okay, last 4 times I've been to Bristol, always been late. Through no fault of my own, I'm going to do everything I can to be on time, everything in my power that I can control, I'm going to do what I can. I'm literally sat on the train, I'm like what king of the conkers? Like, what am I supposed to do? Anyway, we've got I will say this, what's really kind of interesting about British Academy is I was very fortunate to be asked to do this maybe 18 months ago now. Feels like that, maybe 14 months ago. And I couldn't do it at the time. And one of the things that they bestow on you is that you're allowed to choose the place you want to do it. And I've always had a huge affinity for this place. I love Bristol as a uni so much. And they asked me where, all the unis you could choose, where do you want to go? And I said, here. So to be here again I don't know how many times I've spoken at Bristol, but it's a lot. It's a lot. So I really do love this place and have a huge affinity for the people here. So it's not lost on me that it's a Thursday evening and you've all taken the time to be here to break bread with me this evening. So up front, I'm hugely grateful. I'm going to try and hopefully make this as interesting as possible. So it's probably best to kind of situate this within the context of the album and my life in particular. So, July 2012, best summer of my life, the best 4 weeks of my life. And there was a couple of events that happened. So, this particular album has been sort of the soundtrack to my life in many respects. I was very fortunate to hear this album from a very young age. And, you know, in 2012 was the 25th anniversary of Graceland. So it was 25th anniversary of the album. And I found myself in this amazing summer, this kind of beautiful Indian summer that I'd had. And there was 3 things that happened. I was fortunate enough to run with the Olympic torch. I got my first gig in academia. And I went to Hard Rock Calling, and I saw, on the Friday night, I saw Paul McCartney. And on the Saturday, I saw Paul Simon and the whole kind of act of the Graceland group. And I remember standing there at this particular point with my younger brother and just thinking, this is insane. Like, we've listened to this album our whole life. And to give you some idea, the likelihood of that whole collective being brought together after 25 years was highly unlikely for a lot of reasons that I'm going to go into. So it was insane, and I was, you know, me and Simon stood there, we just couldn't believe it. I think at one point we were both crying, like, and we just out of sheer happiness. I was thinking, it'll never get better than this. It'll never get better than this, and it actually didn't. That was as great as it got. And I've been fortunate enough throughout my life. I've been to over 500 music gigs, but that one is still the best gig bar none. So I'll take you back to this particular story. Graceland. So why is it such an iconic album? There are a number of reasons that make Graceland a really iconic album. I would, you know, if we just position this first with Paul Simon as an individual, I guess one of the most important things I always say, it's always up for debate, who are the great singer-songwriters? Who is the greatest singer-songwriter? So, you know, let's put that up front and we can argue afterwards. I would say Paul Simon stands alone. I think there's a couple of people that joined him on that plinth, but, you know, in terms of first, second and third, I would put Paul Simon number 1 as the greatest singer-songwriter. And I guess part of it is this amazing back catalogue, which really goes back to him being a musician, well, becoming a professional musician at the age of 16. And famously, he begun that journey with Art Garfunkel. And a lot of people kind of contest that a lot of Paul Simon's best work really happened when he was with Art Garfunkel. Now, Paul Simon was in a really interesting situation in his life, okay? And I don't want to teach people to suck eggs, but there's a minutiae about this particular album that's a really, really important detail, which does chime with a lot of the work that I generally do around cultural studies and racism, generally speaking. But before we get to that bit, it's important to have this pre-context. So Paul Simon has this unbroken string of hits, right, from the age of 16, literally when he first kind of comes into the music scene from around early 60s to the late 70s, okay? And he finds himself in this situation. He's at this kind of musical crossroads. So he's had this fallout with kind of Art Garfunkel, which most people will know. And, you know, he's been a solo artist, a successful solo artist for some time. So Art Garfunkel, obviously the voice. Paul Simon was always jealous of Art Garfunkel because he had this amazing, beautiful voice. Art Garfunkel was massively jealous of Paul Simon because Paul Simon could write all these beautiful songs. Now, what was really interesting is that, again, you've got this unbroken string of hits, and then he hits a road bump in 1983, and he releases an album called Hearts and Bones. So he's had these commercial hits, and he's actually experienced his first commercial flop. Now, his first commercial flop is this album, Hearts and Bones. And now, up until this point, Warner Brothers were always kind of like, whoa, like, you know, what's the hit? What's the hit on the record? What's the hit on the record? And, you know, it was just a commercial flop. So they said, well, we're not happy with this. And at this particular point in time, music as an industry was changing. So there was lots of, apart from anything else, you have kind of new wave coming in, you have new romantics, you have a completely different music scene taking over globally, which is really being spearheaded by what's happening in Europe, particularly Great Britain at the time, or England to be very specific. And one of the things that's kind of really interesting with that is that you kind of have these separate genres that are really kind of occupying the airwaves. So you have also reggae, which kind of really hit, I wouldn't say hit a crescendo then, but you really had the work of Bob Marley really imprinting that in a really significant way, particularly during his time in London. But obviously, as you'll know, Bob Marley died in 1981. So there was still this kind of legacy of reggae artists that were coming through. So Bunny Wailer was coming through. You had Aswad. You had all of these people that were still coming through. So you had this kind of important imprint. You had the kind of emergence, or I guess I call it the death, but he comes back again, of James Brown, who had kind of been the godfather of soul, but then ends up being in this crazy situation where 2 years, within the mid-80s, he becomes almost probably the most, he has a resurgence because of Rocky IV, living in America, and finds himself in a situation where he becomes the most sampled artist, probably still is, in history. Okay, so we get to this position where Paul Simon speaks to Warner Brothers, and they say to him, look, you've produced a doozy of an album, a really bad album. So he's like, okay, fine. No one has any expectations of me. I'm kind of the runt of the litter now. People think I've lost my musical prowess, my musical powers. Just leave me to it. Just leave me to it. And so for 3 years, that's what they did. They left him to it. They didn't touch him. They didn't ask him, where's the next record? When's the next big hit coming? They just left him to it. 3 years later, within this 3 years, Simon embarks on this musical journey. And I guess it's very different to what he'd done before. So it's kind of one of the first examples, I guess, in Western terms of music collaboration. Okay, now there is a cultural appropriation element there, which isn't necessarily new. And when we kind of think of how black music is repackaged and given to white people, that in itself is an interesting phenomenon. So if we take kind of some of the most obvious examples like Elvis, the Beatles, the Stones, they're a great example of that, particularly in the 1960s. And what you have is this situation where Paul Simon follows his musical ear. So he takes an interest in African music at this particular time. I'm shortening this story for the purpose of time, but there's more to this. But he takes an interest in African music, and in particular, the dulcet tones of Sowetans in Africa, particularly South Africa. And his ear draws to music collectives in South Africa. So at this particular point in time, you have musical acts like Stimela. So Stimela was a three-piece, and this particular three-piece was made up of three musicians, one called Petiti Kamalo, who was a bassist, Isaac Machale, who was a drummer, and Ray Fury, who was a lead guitarist. And what was really interesting about them is that, obviously, during the throes and the stranglehold of apartheid, they weren't allowed to be, working musicians, obviously within the stranglehold of apartheid. Paul Simon, in his infinite wisdom, speaks to Harry Belafonte. And Harry Belafonte, he asks Harry Belafonte for some advice. And he says to Harry Belafonte, right, I want to go to South Africa and I want to work with these township musicians. Quote, Harry Belafonte says to him, go easy on that. You might want to speak to the ANC first, so the African National Congress. You might want to speak to them first before you do anything. Paul Simon's kind of like, look, I'm Paul Simon. If I want to speak to someone and I want to make music, I'm gonna do that, because politics does not stand in the way of music. And that's exactly what he did. He didn't listen to Harry Belafonte, and he just went and did it. So he worked with these kind of township musicians. The difference is, Paul Simon was a free man. He was a free man. These musicians that he was working with were not free people. They were not free in every sense of the word. So he goes to South Africa, and he ends up kind of liaising with these musicians. And what's really interesting is that his own perceptions are challenged, because up until this point, he hadn't actually worked with black musicians. So his own kind of stereotypes and judgments are challenged. And one of his first kind of episodes that he experiences it, he speaks to one of the sound engineers, and he works with a group called Ladysmith Black Mambazo, who are a harmony group. And part of their sound was really driven by the environment, the chirping of the birds, the whistling of the trees, the whistling of the night. It was that kind of thing. They took all of these things around them, and so how they heard music and their inclination was very different to Simon, who in some respects was not a classically trained musician, literally, but had been a musician all his life and heard music very differently through a Western ear, so to speak. And what was really interesting is that he spoke to the sound engineer. The sound engineer said to him, you know, they can't do it. They're not like you and I. They just can't do it. And Paul Simon says, yeah, I agree with you, because they've tried to kind of amalgamate and make this work so many times. It's like the sound engineer says, they're not like us. They just can't do it. They don't have it. And Paul Simon said the one mistake he made, which by the way, he made many mistakes, but the one mistake he admitted to was that he bought into that. And so that predicated a lot of his thinking throughout the album, which was really interesting. But then he gets this kind of critical point where Joseph Shabalala says to Ladysmith and Barzo, right, we are going to nail this track if it kills us. We're going to nail this track if it kills us. And the track is a track called Homeless. Right? Which then bridges on to Diamonds on the Soles of Their Shoes. And he says to him, Joseph Shabalala says to the crew, we're going to nail this track. So they spend all night practicing and nailing down this track over and over and over again. By this point, Joseph's not aware that Simon has this kind of racialized thinking around their deficit thinking around their musical abilities. Completely doesn't have that in mind. Paul Simon then works with Ray Fury, who is a black South African guitarist who is in Stamela. And, Paul Simon parks homeless to one side and decides to start working on the title track, Graceland. And Paul Simon's feeling with that song was that it was going to be autobiographical. So he's going to talk in some respects about his childhood, and he was particularly moved by Sun Records. So he had a real kind of penchant for listening to kind of Johnny Cash, kind of Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, and he has all of these people that he kind of takes a lot of direction from because it influenced a lot of his childhood and his own musical inclination. But he's taking an African rhythm and trying to place this within there. So he asks Isaac Machale to give him a drum beat. And Isaac Machale, who's the drummer in Stamela, gives him this drum beat. And I guess it's his interpretation of what a Sun record would sound like. But it's slightly offbeat, which is not a bad thing, but it's his inclination. And so Simon runs with this and thinks, this is okay. So then he asks Ray Fury, what's your inclination of it? And Ray Fury puts these kind of amazing kind of licks in this amazing song, and it starts slowly coming together. And then he asks the kind of Everly brothers to kind of chime in on that as well. And what's really interesting is that from that episode with Ray Fury, he begins to see these musicians very differently. But the political kind of entwinement is that when Simon refers to being the boy in the bubble, which is also one of the songs on the album, he has no understanding of the political context of South Africa. He has absolutely no understanding. And there is an arrogance, there is obviously a privilege in being able to completely obscure that for the purpose of music. And his belief was, well, wars don't last and music does. Now that's for us to contest and debate, and he may well be right about that. But he finds himself in a situation where lots of South African protesters at the time are saying to him, there is a cultural boycott. So at this particular point in time, South Africa is literally, they've been sidelined from everything. And the thing that meant the most to South Africans at that time wasn't necessarily music, but it was Springbok rugby, Proteas cricket, and those things hugely meant something quite significant to South African people, particularly white Afrikaners, not South Africans generally, white Afrikaners. And Paul Simon kind of doesn't really heed a lot of this advice. And that becomes kind of the first thing that he thinks is slightly uneasy. So what he actually does is he says, I feel unsafe in South Africa. I feel unsafe. So he's not really reflecting any kind of prose that recognises that actually I've infringed on this boycott really out of self-interest, and now I'm trying to position it as though I'm working with these township musicians, and actually it's a collaborative endeavour and they want to do it. And so he takes everyone to New York, takes the whole group to New York. And obviously what's interesting for these black South Africans is that in many respects, well, in all respects, it's their first taste of freedom. Because in South Africa, they had to have passes to be able to go to places, and they just weren't allowed to go to places, as you'll all be aware of, during apartheid. So you have this situation where the musicians feel a bit more free. They feel, this sense of, we're participating in this endeavour. And it seems a bit more collaborative, a bit more participatory, because there is that element of freedom, the one thing we all cherish more than anything, that liberty, that freedom, that egalitarian space. And Simon starts to recognise them as not only individuals, but people that are on his level, which is something he hadn't done because he, by his own admission, had been quite arrogant in terms of what he felt about these musicians. And what's really interesting is how much then, in that space, they feel more confident to challenge a lot of the things that he's doing. So when we kind of think of songs like, what's a good example, Under African Skies, one of the things that he's advised on is that he works with a white female musician on this track. And it's at that point he's advised that if we ever go live with this, there is only one person who would be best suited to sing this particular song. So Paul Simon's still, sitting in that arrogance. Is like, well, who? I've made this suggestion. And Joseph Shabalala says to him, there's only one person you can ask. And I think that's Miriam Makeba. This is the person you need to ask. Miriam Makeba, the Queen of South Africa. Not literally, but she's christened the Queen of South Africa. And one of the things that becomes really interesting is that he doesn't heed this particular advice. But then he kind of thinks about it and thinks about it and thinks about it. And he starts kind of thinking about, right, we need to think about how we put this whole machine together. Because by this point, it gets to 1986, the album's due for release, and they begin to start thinking, as with all albums, how are we going to tour this album within the throes of apartheid? There's lots of things that we need to think about. So he kind of speaks to Joseph Shabalala, and Joseph Shabalala gives him a list of people that he needs to work with. And he says the top of this list, or at the top of these two lists, are Miriam Makeba and Hugh Masekela. Now, Hugh Masekela is one of the great kind of horn instrumentalists ever, okay? And famously he had this song called Stimela. And it talks about basically a long train that comes from Malawi that goes all the way through southern Africa. And it used to carry slaves on this train and people that were kind of trying to find some solace on this train to get into different parts of southern Africa in terms of finding solace, particularly in the throes of apartheid. And so they kind of start thinking about this touring band, and bit by bit starts coming together. So Warner Brothers knock on the door, right? Warner Brothers say, Mr. Simon. They're like, Mr. Simon's like, what? They say, Mr. Simon, we've left you for 3 years, okay? Now we want to know, what's the big hit? It's like, well, because this is the question he's always been asked his whole career. Where's the hits? So, Miss Robinson, me and Julio by the schoolyard, Cecilia, where's the big hit this time? So he says, there is no hit. There's just a collection of songs. And they're like, look, Simon, tell us the hit. So he's like, there is no hit. So they said, okay, right. I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to put you on Saturday Night Live. And he's like, we're not ready yet. We haven't got the touring band. He said, I don't care. We're going to put you on Saturday Night Live, and we're going to see how this all turns out. As it turns out, they go on Saturday Night Live. With no hit necessarily declared by this point, other than the fact that they surmise that the album is called Graceland, so maybe the title track will be called, that might be the hit on the album. They go on Saturday Night Live, and for Americans, and the global world generally speaking, this was quite a remarkable phenomenon, because not only had South Africa been completely shielded from the world for the reasons that we all know, but you end up with a situation where you have 10 South African men in traditional dresses, all singing, all dancing, all moving in unison, and you have Paul Simon singing. And Paul Simon, on this particular moment, with Lady Smith Blackman Barzo, is singing Diamonds on the Soles of Their Shoes. Now, everybody's mind's blown, because they just haven't seen this before. And Paul Simon's kind of thinking, okay, this is great. This is all going great. Warner Brothers come back to them and say, oh my God, like, Simon, like, this is Paul's Mr. Well, at this point they've gone to Paul now, because they're like, Paul, this is brilliant. This is brilliant. Your musical, your genius is back at the fore. You are right back at the top where you belong. This is brilliant. Paul Simon's lapping this all up. You know, he's literally just drinking this all in, and eating this all. And he's loving it. He's full. He's absolutely, you know, when you've eaten too much and you're like in a food coma, that's where Paul Simon is at this point. He's lapping it all up. And it's quite obvious at this point there are several things he has not thought about. So he ends up, at that particular point in struggle, you had everyone who was united in terms of that cultural boycott. In particular, young black Americans who were at university at the time, particularly at black historical colleges. And for them, they were like, right, we want to make Mr. Simon, well, they didn't call him Mr. Simon, no, we want to make Paul accountable. We want to ask him that as a privileged white man, please explain to us how you were able to circumnavigate the cultural boycott, work with these township musicians, and something tells us that actually you are the one that's profiting from this situation. That is cultural appropriation, by their definition at that particular point in time, and to be honest with you, by my own. But what was really interesting was his refusal. Now, if you remember, Mr. Belafonte comes back, and Simon, with his tail between his legs, walks back to Mr. Harry Belafonte and says, Harry, I think I made a mistake. Harry Belafonte's like, I told you need to speak to the ANC. I made that very, very clear. And and Harry Belafonte says to him, listen, I can try and patch some of this up, but this is going to be very, very difficult for you to reposition this, because I warned you that that was a space that you should not go into to make music. Paul Simon says, look, music always outlasts politics. I don't get this. But for the first time, he's in a situation where he's actually pressed by these activists, these academic activists. What's your reason for being there? What's your reason for being there? How have you gained permission to be in that space? And how are you actually supporting a wider movement to end apartheid? Because the only person who's benefiting from this situation is you. And, you know, Simon finds himself stuck. Paul Simon finds himself stuck. You know, there is no avenue he can turn down that can really make that justification, other than the fact that I had their permission to be there. Now, anyone who knows enough about South Africa would know that the likelihood of black township musicians having any kind of authority to say, Paul Simon, you come here, you come to us, is completely unlikely. It just wouldn't have happened. So at this point, Simon's like floundering. He's absolutely floundering. He's got no leg to stand on. And there is only one person who bails him out of this situation. And the person who bails him out of this situation is, if Miriam Makeba is the queen of South Africa, and let's just say Nelson Mandela is the king, then I don't know, the heir apparent would be Hugh Masekela. Hugh Masekela comes in and he speaks to, I guess, a black audience in terms of a black global populace and his own domestic populace, which would be South Africa. And he says, look, we are musicians. And yes, Miriam Makeba and others have sought asylum from the throes of this horrible regime. But this is an amazing opportunity for us to showcase South African music. It's an amazing opportunity for us to showcase what is beautiful about South Africa. The world has this view of South Africa as being this horrible, oppressed country, particularly for black South Africans. And this is our chance to disrupt that in Technicolor. This is our opportunity to do that. For decades, people do not know what's happening in this country because there is no vantage point that anyone can adopt for us to be able to see. All they have are these horrendous images, one being Stephen Biko. Okay? So as the kind of white Afrikaner legend had it, until these pictures were revealed, Stephen Biko died of hunger strike. Now, those of you who've ever seen the open casket of Stephen Biko will, that doesn't look to me as though someone died of hunger strike. What actually happened was he was beaten to death. And a lot of prisoners in South Africa, black prisoners, died of hunger strike. Their bodies were never found and they were never brought to these families. So that was a really, really powerful thing. But Hugh Masekela, who had been, to all extents, on, I would say, a difficult end, but not the real sharp end, because he was out of that environment without any judgment. He would need to be, because he pursued this musical career. And so he spoke to South Africans, and he was really the segue for Simon to kind of seek forgiveness. And he was also the person that pricked Paul Simon's conscience to say, if you want to come out of this alive, when this goes on tour, you cannot receive any money for this, because you need to reposition yourself as this white person, this white privileged male who has exploited these township musicians. Paul Simon, I wouldn't say he hesitantly agrees to this, but he recognises actually, yes, there is some penance that I do need to pay. And so this, in 1987, they go on tour, and they end the tour in Zimbabwe, which in itself was a really unique thing, given that Zimbabwe had recently been experiencing its own independence, of which it was around 8-7 years by that point. And famously, Bob Marley's tribute to Zimbabwe was to actually write a song called Zimbabwe to speak to their independence. And this concert goes down a storm. It goes down an absolute storm. You have all of the musicians there. It's an entirely black, it's the best of black. It's unbelievable. You have all these township musicians. They all, importantly, and it's a very important thing. One of the things that was really interesting, if you can just entertain me while I take this no food, no drink sign. Just picture this, instead of this being this, it's an album sleeve, right? It's an album sleeve. So you open the album, and what was really interesting was, which I guess people hadn't anticipated, was that all of the songs, all of the musicians were credited. And straight away, one of the things people start thinking is, okay, they're all going to be equally remunerated and equally paid. Now, that became a really significant thing, because one of the accusations was that actually Paul Simon wasn't going to, remunerate these musicians appropriately. He was going to take all the songwriting credits, and he didn't. And I guess the big kind of arguments that have always come with this is that, was it cultural appropriation? Did Simon go over to South Africa, and was he an opportunist? Did he see this opportunity that he could monetize and bank upon? Fiscally and reputationally. I wouldn't say I'm a cynical person, and it's very difficult to kind of think where this kind of sits in the pantheon of these types of arguments. I think it's difficult. I think it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Okay? And it is difficult because the truth is, if we work on the premise that Simon exploited these musicians, then what we also have to acknowledge is that we're saying that these musicians didn't have any autonomy or agency. Now, there was a point where they didn't have any autonomy or agency in South Africa, but that opportunity did give them autonomy and agency to be the musicians that they've always wanted to be. The other side of it is that a small group of people being free is not an equivalent to an entire community or country being free. So is there something to suggest that those musicians were putting their own interests before that of the nation, because they could have potentially said, actually, I really appreciate this opportunity, but this is not going to serve a free South Africa, given how many people had given their lives for the struggle. Now, it's a very difficult thing, because one wouldn't want to place judgment, particularly having not been in that situation. But one of the things that is kind of really interesting is Paul Simon's original feeling, which was from a disposition of arrogance, that I follow my musical ear and music always outlasts any kind of political war or societal battle. Now, one can make the argument that, you know, in terms of the spoils of that particular record, all of the individuals all of the stakeholders involved in that record profited handsomely. You know, it was a multiple Grammy Award-winning record, sold over 60 million copies to date. You have a situation where it's, you know, continuously listed in the top 100, top 50, top 10 greatest albums of all time. Paul Simon reflects back on that period, given this amazing back catalogue of work he's got, and says that that was about as perfect as I could have been as a musician. That's about as perfect as could have been. And he says the most perfect track he ever put together, he ever composed, was Graceland. Now, I would say The Boxer, in terms of his work, is probably the best piece he's ever composed. But he himself has said Graceland was perfect. He couldn't have made it any more perfect if he tried. And that is an interesting phenomenon. But what he now concedes is that the inclination of those musicians, Ray Fury, Petiti Kamalo on bass, is what actually, and their interpretation of what Sun Records sounded like, particularly as South African musicians, that is what makes the record. That is what's made the record. Now, I guess if we kind of take it to the present, because like I said, it's a long story, and you haven't got all night. I'm already taken 10 years off your life. You'll never get back. I guess we go right back to the start when I told you about kind of being there in 2012. Now, it was a really surreal thing because that album I'd listened to my entire life. It'd been a huge part, like I said, the soundtrack to my life. I would always say to anyone, someone asked me, what's your favourite album of all time? I'd say Graceland. Best album of all time. So at no stage in my life could I have envisaged being in a situation where I see this album in real life, as in all the musicians, every single person. The only musician that's missing is Miriam Makeba. Miriam Makeba is the only musician that's missing because by that point, sadly, she'd died in 2010, I think. So to see all of those musicians there, it was surreal. It was absolutely surreal. I cannot emphasise how surreal it was. I just remember my younger brother Simon being, I was just like squeezing him. I think at one point I kissed him on the lips. He was like, he's like, Jason, control yourself. And I was kind of like, I was just so happy. I couldn't believe it. We were both just in ecstasy at that moment. And then there's this moment where the kind of evening kind of calms down. And I think Simon says to me in the most sobering way, he's like, you know, Jason, this collective, we're never going to see this again. We're never going to see this again. Not just us, everyone that's here, because all of these people are in their 70s. Like, if they're able to kind of, you know, if they can do this again, it's another 10 years. And 10 years would have taken us to 2022. And, you know, I mean, Simon's not Nostradamus, but he was right. You know, pretty much all of the musicians on that record, with the exception of Petiti Kamalo and Paul Simon himself, all of them have sadly passed away. So in that moment, you realise something really special is happening. And it lent me to kind of, you know, and a few weeks before that, I'd seen this amazing documentary by Alan Yentob, and it was part of the Imagine series, and it was called Under African Skies, and it actually focused on the story of Graceland. But the way the story was told, it was very much romanticised. It didn't actually challenge some of the problematic nature of cultural appropriation. It didn't really do that, and it didn't really spend enough time liaising with anti-apartheid activists who really, really were in opposition to the way Simon went about his business during that time. But that being said, there was this recognition that actually, you know, Simon, well, this is an amazing moment here. This is an amazing moment. And I often think about, there's probably not a day that's gone by since 2012 where I've not thought about that particular gig, particularly because I listened to this album. I've listened to it like once a week since I was 15. And sadly, I'm 40 next year. So that's a long, long time that I've been listening to it. And one of the things that I think is really, really interesting is this idea that Simon had at the very beginning. No matter what the public thing that's happening, the war of attrition that's happening, music always lasts. Now, it's not to minimise apartheid and say people don't remember apartheid, because South Africa in of itself, its own independence is less than 35 years old. But it is to say that actually, what do people feel when they listen to an album? Where are they taken back to? And this just doesn't apply to Graceland now. This just applies to any particular album. Where are you taken back to when you listen to that album? Because actually, in terms of the test of time, Simon was right. But the political kind of quandary that he found himself in was actually, morally, what morals did I abandon to make that advancement? And I never talk about my research. And also because in some respects, this is not really what I'm known for doing, even though this is the thing I'm most interested in, cultural studies, music, the arts. But once you get kind of pigeonholed as the race and higher education guy, that's just how it is. But it's an interest that I wish I didn't have to have, because I just wish things were fair. But if someone asked me, what's the thing that really, 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 arouses you, for want of a better term, I'd say it's music, it's the arts, it's the kind of stories behind these types of things. And for me, the question that I would put to all of you, because I never position myself as someone that knows everything, I don't, but what I do want to engage in is an open dialogue about what you all think about this as well, is, was Simon right? Was Simon right? Was he right to make that musical amalgamation? Was he right to do that in the throes of a country where black people were not free? Or did he use that music unknowingly as a vehicle and as an instrument to unconsciously create this sense of liberation for those musicians who in part were able to demonstrate to the world the context, the texture, the fabric, the context of South Africa. South Africa is this beautiful country, because there were obviously other musicians, African musicians, who had already done that for the continent of Africa. If we think of Fela Kuti being a really, really good example of that. Okay, so it's kind of really putting that kind of, it's not a rhetorical question, it's a general open question just for all of us to think about, because there is sometimes that rub and that friction and that disconnect. I'm mindful of time. So, just want to say, if you listened to this album, or if you haven't, I would presume quite a few people have, You Can Call Me Al is actually his attempt, and Boy in a Bubble is his attempt to kind of explain his experience being this fish out of water in South Africa. And read the lyrics. The lyrics are always a really powerful thing to read in these spaces, because he actually talks about the fact that he was out of his depth. He was way out of his depth. And actually, since then, there's been this concession that I wish I had listened to Harry Belafonte, because there are certain things he would have done differently. And one thing that's interesting, he's always asked, if you had been advised not to make the album, what would you have done? He said, I would have made that album, no matter what. And that in itself is interesting. But it would have been impossible to do. The actual central character in this album, ironically, is not Paul Simon. It's these South African township musicians. Ray Fury, Joseph Shabalala, Fury, who was the accordion player, Isaac Machale, Patiti Kamalo. These were the stars of the show. And it was the first time in Paul Simon's career he had to take a back seat. And something now, in his older, wiser age, he acknowledges himself. So, at the risk of boring you to tears anymore, I just want to say, it really means a lot to me that you would listen to the musings of a madman from South London. It never gets any easier looking at my stupid, shiny face in these situations, but it's been an absolute privilege to break bread with you. I really appreciate it. And if nothing else, I always had it as a dream 12 years ago. I said to my younger brother when we was in Hyde Park, one day, if I'm ever fortunate enough, at this point I was still a PE teacher, so if I'm ever fortunate enough one day to be an academic or whatever, I'm going to talk about this. And he was like, do you know what? He started laughing and he's like, do you know what, Jay? If anyone could do it, it's probably you. And 12 years later, here we are. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank Thank you so much,
Oh,
Jason.
no, thank you.
That was fantastic. I'm sure there are lots of questions round the room. Natasha has a roving mic, so put your hand up if you'd like to ask a question, and I can also run around with this one as well. So, questions, comments, thoughts on the best track in the album, anything else that people want to chip in with. Yeah. Just trying to get the mic just so that everyone will be able to pick it up. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a bit of a left field question, but the music that you mentioned, that is the song about the train, what is that called again? Because I've heard a group do that.
By Hugh Masekela, it's called Stimela.
Stimela.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And he's narrating this story of kind of, black Southern Africans kind of taking this train as like this mode of freedom. And it's an amazing song, and it's a really long interlude. So he's talking about it, then he goes into it. I don't want to do an impression of it because I wouldn't be doing it justice, but it's amazing because he actually replicates the sound of the train himself, and it's really, really powerful. It has the same kind of power that when Tracy Chapman is talking about Across the Lines, it has that same kind of power. You can close your eyes and you can feel yourself in that moment. So if you get a chance, listen to it. It's brilliant.
Yeah, there is a musical group who are a pub choir who sing that, and it's really lovely.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Look, thank you so much for your question, by the way. And cool tattoo. I think I saw it on the inside. It's great.
Anyone else?
Thanks. Had Paul Simon actually reached out to the ANC and gotten sign-off to go beyond the boycott, would it have still been as much an act of cultural appropriation, but one with fewer political fallout effects? Or would they have likely made demands up front that could have actually saved them the whole damage control process later on and actually made it less of an appropriative experience?
That's a great question. In terms of cultural appropriation as well, one of the things that's interesting and something I've had to do myself is who decides what cultural appropriation is, and can it be quite limiting? Now, that's me trying to be as objective as possible, which is quite important in my work, given that the charge always made is that one draws a lot of these musings from subjective conjecture. But I do think if he'd asked the ANC, they would have said no. And I think deep down, I'm surmising here, but I think Paul Simon knew that. And when I was putting this book together, that was one of the things I kind of had to really think about. And I was very fortunate to speak. I went to South Africa and I got to speak to a lot of these township musicians in 2016, 2017. And now those interviews mean even more to me because they're not here anymore. And one of the things that's really interesting is that they're all aware that if he had spoken to the ANC, it would have been a blanket no. Tambo and Beckett at the time was very, very clear that it was a cultural boycott and nobody was to break that cultural boycott, and everybody had respected that cultural boycott. In fact, Simon and a musician called Linda Rostat were the two that didn't. So Linda before Simon, and they both didn't respect the cultural boycott. So he wouldn't have been able to make that record. I'm guessing he would have had to take those musicians from an oppressed situation to a free situation, which was New York, America. But I don't think it would have happened. I'm almost certain it wouldn't have done. But I could be wrong. And I always say I do not position myself as the font of all knowledge, because that I'm definitely not. Thank you.
You mentioned that the album has sort of been like a soundtrack to your life. And I'm wondering, how did you first come to the album? And how do you feel about it now, after studying it sort of more objectively from an academic lens rather than when you were younger, just sort of enjoying the music?
Oh, that's a great question. So it was my dad. My dad's got this unbelievable music collection. I don't think I'm his favourite kid, but I was the one who took the most interest in music, so I've kind of just been lifting those records, and as his memory's been going, as he's been getting older, they've just ended up in my collection. So that's kind of how it started. And he was amazing. My dad was an amazing musician anyway, so he was always playing along to these records as a kid, and there was always musical instruments in the house, and he just played lots of different records, and he loves that particular record. But for me, there was just something that kind of really chimed with it, in the same way that I remember the first time listening to Definitely Maybe, and I was like, I've got nothing in common with 5 white working class guys from Burnage, Manchester, but the idea of these 5 guys being like, we've only got a hope and a prayer, and we're going to try and take on the world and win, and our job is not, we don't even want to be the best band in the country, we just want to be the best band on our street. I loved that. I loved that, because anything that's underdog, I'm all over it. And so Paul Simon wasn't an underdog in this situation, but actually it was this amazing showcase of African music. And having been brought up in an African household, it just chimed in with all the great African songs that I'd listened to. And also there was a lot of the songs that were in my house at the time a lot of them were liberatory songs. So you had liberatory music. So, you had a lot of African musicians. Bob Marley was, I would say that's probably the records that I listened to the most as a kid. And my dad will argue, it's not a coincidence you ended up doing what you're doing. It's not a coincidence you ended up with dreadlocks on your head, because you were fascinated by that as a child. So for me, like anything that kind of showcased, black music, black endeavour, black excellence, I don't think it was by design that my parents had that music in the house. Obviously they didn't know what me and my brothers would go on and do, but it's that was, you listen to something, you kind of think it's amazing, but then the worst part of anything, so I'm going to tell you something, and obviously keep this between us, right? But I love Home and Away and Neighbours a lot, right? A lot. And the worst thing that happened to me with Home and Away and Neighbours was becoming a sociologist. Because when I started watching Home and Away and Neighbours, before I'd just watch it, and it was escapism. For 1 hour, I was in Australia on 7 Network. Then you become a sociologist and you start looking at things through a different lens. So part of it is you think, okay, well, Australia has an indigenous population, First Islanders. How come none of them are present in this utopia that's Summer Bay? Then you have kind of Ramsay Street, and you think, oh my God, there's no people. You start looking at it really differently, and you kind of think lots of this have different kind of people that are in it, but they're not, it's not reflected in these spaces. So the problem is that once you have that lens, you do start to question things in a slightly different way. So you start understanding what cultural appropriation means in the context of music, and how historically this has been like a ritualic practice that white musicians have done to black musicians. And then you start looking at things slightly differently, and the romanticism and the kind of shiny new wrapping that something has, then it doesn't become as great anymore. I mean, so now I'm watching Home and Away, and it's not the same, but going to Australia for an hour a day, I kind of need to do it to stay sane. But but you look at things completely differently, and that goes to everything. You start looking at lots of stuff through this more critical lens. So in some ways, you kind of, ignorance is bliss. You kind of protect that. You have that virginity, and you don't look at things in those ways. But once it's that kind of veil is moved, you start looking at things in a very different way. And I guess when you start looking at the music in a different way, there are certain musicians that when you put them in the wash, they come out still nice. And there's certain musicians, when you put them in the wash, there's still a lot of marks on that beautiful garment. And there's nothing wrong with those. There is something wrong with those marks, as long as we acknowledge them. That doesn't necessarily take away from the music, but it does make us question, okay, what are some of the processes that were involved, and who may have been exploited in those processes. It was easier when I didn't know this stuff, but when you do know it, you can't turn a blind eye to it, particularly as someone that engages with other amazing colleagues in the work of disrupting and dismantling racism.
We have a couple of questions online. So do you know how many of the songs on the album were first written in South Africa, thinking about diamonds on the soles of her shoes? Do they show Paul Simon was becoming alert to the politics?
No, that's a great question. So most of the songs were written in South Africa. The album was completed in the US, in New York. Paul Simon wasn't particularly politically au fait with what was happening in South Africa. A lot of people weren't. And I would imagine that as a musician that was probably quite self-invested. He didn't have any interest in that. For him, it was about following that musical ear, and it just so happened that his musical ear took him to South Africa, to these township musicians. But he wasn't actually interested, and something he's conceded and admitted himself, and others who have commentated on his work, he wasn't interested in that aspect of it, which was a hugely important aspect because South Africa was not a liberated country at that time, and it actually compromised. It could have, if Hugh Masekela had not made his intervention, that album would not have been successful. The reason it's successful is because Hugh Masekela made that intervention, and actually individuals became more invested in those township musicians. And the ones that probably came to the public and global consciousness the most were Ladysmith Black Mambazo, who then subsequently became this amazing touring kind of Harlem Globetrotters act, which if you had the opportunity to see them, you'll realise how amazing they are. A lot of the original kind of makeup of that of the 10 of them, a lot of them have passed, including Joseph Shabalala, who passed in 2018. But his children, 3 of his sons, are actually in Ladysmith Black Mambazo now. So if you get an opportunity to see them, they often play Royal Albert Hall and tour UK quite often. Go and see them because it's quite a remarkable thing. It's a cappella, it's Africa at its best, and the fact they've managed to keep that legacy going is quite incredible.
We do have another question online. Have you talked to Paul Simon yourself? Do you forgive his arrogance?
Do I forgive his arrogance? On one hand, you kind of think like the conker's on this guy. This is pretty impressive. On the other hand, which is a much bigger hand, there's 2 things. I haven't, and without saying too much, I will get the opportunity to. And I don't say that boastfully. I say that because I've been fortunate to be included in a project with the BBC. And a big part of it is that I think with Paul Simon, I think there's always been that slight insecurity for a number of reasons. Like Paul Simon, not that I'm a heightist and not that I'm particularly tall. I mean, these trainers are giving me a bit more bass, but really, like I'm not. But the thing I would say, Paul Simon's 5'4", I believe. He's 5'4", and Art Garfunkel was 5'11", if not touching 6 foot. And this was always something that bothered him. It really, really bothered him. And so I think part of that insecurity and part of that arrogance actually stems from these kind of perceptions that people have of Paul Simon as this kind of little kind of musician, particularly with someone like Art Garfunkel, who in some respects had everything that Paul Simon wanted. Art Garfunkel was not only an amazing vocalist, an amazing singer with unbelievable range, he was also an actor. And in that kind of early 1960s, he had a particular look that Hollywood really, really glamorized. And, you know, Paul Simon, on the other hand, was like, done it. So he didn't have all those things. And, you know, and then Art Garfunkel looked at Paul Simon and was like, oh my God, you can write these beautiful songs. And, you know, when it all breaks even, I'm not getting no money because you wrote all the music. So I think it comes from a place of, that arrogance actually comes from a place of insecurity. And I do wish he'd listened to the late, great Harry Belafonte, because I think there could have been another way of doing that album that could have safeguarded the integrity of the cultural boycott. But also there's the side that his argument, which was that wars don't last and music always does. And the truth is, when people talk about Graceland, it's a fleeting engagement or a fleeting kind of memory that he boycotted. He didn't respect the cultural boycott. But what they do always point to is like, right, the boy in the bubble, I know what I know. You know, you can call me Al. They point to this kind of this back catalogue of amazing tracks that have come off that album, and to this day he hasn't done something that has topped that. And this is a guy who has had one of the greatest singer-songwriter careers of all time. I think the greatest, but there were people who say, like, you know, what about Leonard Cohen or Bob Dylan or, you know, all these other people, but I would place him number one.
Thank you.
Thank you. you know if Paul Simon's talked about and reflected on his involvement in We Are the World, which was also happening around that time, and also says something about the relationship between Western musicians and the African continent?
That's a great question. It's funny. We Are the World. I think that was kind of in response to, you know, they've done Do They Know It's Christmas Time. We need to do something as well. Come on, Black America, we need to do something. And what's kind of really interesting in terms of, at that time you had this kind of conglomerate of artists against apartheid who formed that, and quite interestingly, Paul Weller was a part of that. And I don't know if Paul Weller has some interesting views, and which can be quite problematic. Even though he has black mixed race children, he does have some really problematic views. So they were part of this kind of, I guess, this charge to kind of really think about those things. And his involvement in that, I think he has distanced himself from that. I haven't heard him speak too much about that. I think the charge is always kind of levied at kind of Quincy Jones and Lionel Richie and Michael Jackson having a really big hand in that. But Paul Simon has somehow kind of abstained from kind of being at the forefront of that discussion, even though he was one of the main architects of that. And at that particular point in time, he was he still is a hugely respected musician. But he's never really spoken a lot about that. And it's only up until there was a recent documentary on Netflix about that, where kind of you have Lionel Richie talking on it, and there is a complete romanticization of it. But I think the song itself was problematic because it came in response to Do They Know It's Christmas Time and Bob Geldof's efforts. And what's really interesting about Bob Geldof's efforts is that, you know, reputationally and economically, he profited handsomely from that situation. A little less known fact is that it wasn't actually his idea. I think it was Midger's idea, which he took and just drove the whole thing. I was like, I don't know if you've ever seen, I think most people, give us your effing money. Like, that's what he said, by the way, that's not me saying. Like, that's what he said on the charity drive. And it's kind of really interesting how that turned out. But the whole point was that Quincy Jones kind of said, we're not doing anything. We're black musicians and we're not doing anything. And I guess it's always that thing of, you know, Paul Simon by that point had already pissed off a lot of black people globally. So I don't think he was going to kind of insert himself in that space anymore. Like, the last person we want to see is Paul Simon. Mr. Appropriator, you just take a back seat, you just sit your backside down and you just do what you do from behind the scenes. And I guess for Paul Simon, being behind the scenes is a pretty difficult thing because he's someone that likes to be front and center because of that insecure space that I think, you know, some of that emotional trauma, in inverted commas, that he'd experienced with Art Garfunkel. So I don't think he really said too much on that. But We Are the World and Do They Know It's Christmas Time, particularly Do They Know It's Christmas Time, is problematic for a number of reasons. But he's a toe tapper. He's a toe tapper, which is also problematic, but it is. So yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your talk. I think you've proven that it's such an important case study. But I also wanted to ask about how you've told us the story and the sort of power of story and narrative in creating such a compelling, story today. And so I was just wondering how you see that in terms of your pedagogy and your teaching. Like, do you use this method for some of your other work? Do you see Graceland as particularly easy to do this narrative? He said this and then he said this, or is a lot of your sort of lecturing and teaching like this if it's, you know, other sociology and things like that?
That's a great question. Coming from you of all people, it really means a lot. So thank you so much. Oh. So in terms of, I mean, part of it is that in a previous life, I was a PE teacher. And one of the things that I always realised is how much people hated physical education. They really hated it. So part of my job was, how do you make this entertaining? And one of the things that I always felt about pedagogy and teaching is that the great thing about not being an academic my entire life is that I had these experiences of how you engage people who genuinely don't like something. So, you know, big term in physical education is physical literacy, and physical literacy is how one understands the body. Now, there's lots of ways you can use this, but the greatest mechanism is probably fundamentals of movement. So how do you catch, how do you move in sync, etc. Except if you're working with someone who's dyspraxic, that is not such an easy thing. I always felt that the best educators could take the most difficult kind of concepts and make them easy to understand. But a big part of that is actually how do we bring comedy into these spaces, how do we bring vulnerability into these spaces, authenticity, and also entertainment. My big thing is that you might not have learned anything tonight, but I saw a couple of people laughed. You know, and if nothing else, that is an achievement for me. So that's fine. But a big part of that is actually taking these stories and bringing them to life. Now, one of the things I always make it really, really clear is that, I don't like placing academics as heroes, but this particular one is someone that had a really profound effect on me. So Professor Shirley Ann Tate, she's a black feminist and a black academic. She now resides in Canada, and I think she's like the best storyteller ever. Like, she used storytelling as a mechanism for her work, her amazing work over the last 3 decades. And for me, coming into academia, I remember thinking, like, I will never be able to lace this person's shoes, but I want to be able to at least put one foot on, right? And part of that is how she used storytelling. And it was never from this position of, this is the truth. It was always kind of, how do you leave it open? And so part of what I've tried to do tonight is to give an opinion, but also leave it open. And I think I caveated that many times by saying, I'm not the font of all of this. This is just my own surmisings, subjective surmisings. When you're in a pedagogical learning space, the idea is to create these blanks, which you ideally want students to fill in and construct the knowledge for themselves. So you are a co-producer in that knowledge, as opposed to being the conveyor of knowledge. And so part of that is that sometimes people can come into a lecture and be like, who's leading this thing? And I'm just sat there because there's, it looks like chaos, but it's curated, beautiful, archaic chaos, and it's deliberate. And part of that is leaving the question to hang in the air. Sometimes we'll just stay silent for 10 minutes. Falling short of saying you're spending £9,500 being here. It's that whole thing of actually it's creating that space. And for me, a big part of it is dialogue. It's dialogue. And this idea that actually there's lots of different ways pedagogy can be done. There's a reason why I never use slides. And the reason why I don't use slides as a general rule of thumb, so the cat's out of the bag now. As a PE teacher, you plan these lessons within an inch of your life. So you're like, skill development, main activity, warm up, concluding activity. Kids come in, and then 5 minutes in, the lesson's going nothing like how you plan. You don't know you don't necessarily, with kids, in school, you know who you're presenting to in some respects, you know who you're teaching. But even then, it's really hard to predict all of those unpredictable variables. In a space like this, I had no idea who I was talking to today. And part of it is touch and feel, and it's muscle memory. And I think it's so important for pedagogues to rely on that muscle memory. Sometimes we constrict ourselves. Like, this is our playground. And in this playground, I can do what the hell I want. Doesn't mean people will like it, but I can do what I like. You can do what you like. Everyone can do what they like. And it's about that idea of expression. And it's who's allowed to express themselves. We should all be invested in creating these spaces where people can be as liberated and as free as possible to express themselves pedagogically. And people may say that's idealistic, but I don't believe that. I believe you can do that. You can do that, and obviously if you dip your toes in the water, you got to expect them to get wet. But a big part of it is experimentation. And I think that idea of play, there's no greater sight than seeing unencumbered kids in a park just being free. But for some reason, when we become adults, we restrict each other's ability to play. And it's so important that in these spaces we play, metaphorically speaking and literally. It's so important.
Wow, I think that's a brilliant note to end
Thank you. Great. Fantastic.
We're not quite yet done. Oh, I do have a microphone. I was just going to start shouting at everybody. So we do have a drinks reception for the next 15 minutes or so. So I'm sure lots of you will have other questions for Jason and a chance just to chat a little bit more. Before we that's just out in the foyer, but perhaps I feel we should do another round of
No,
applause. 'Cause
no
thank you
worries.
so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Absolutely fantastic.
Shoes on.
I can put my shoes on.
Yeah,
Yeah, I can,
do.
yeah.
Like,
Thank you.
yeah. Entertaining.
Oh,
As
thank
well
you
as
so much.
entertaining.